So to start off with, let's talk about the threat of entry. In some respects, you could argue the most important of the 5 forces. What are ways in which we might prevent entry into an industry? Now, this is a very important point. An industry is more attractive when entry is more difficult. Now, you might be tempted to say, oh, because it's easy to enter, that makes it more attractive. But that's exactly the wrong logic here. And it relates to an old joke that used to be said, that I don't want to be a member of a club that will have me as a member. In essence, the problem is, if it's easy to enter, it means it will be a highly competitive market. So we'd rather be in an industry that others struggle to enter into. So the industry is more attractive when entry is less likely. Now we can think of a number of different things that might impact why entry might be less likely. As we talked about in the last session, there might be legal barriers to entry, such as patents or copyrights and the like, that simply prevent others from entering the industry. But there's a number of other factors we want to consider as well. The first one we want to consider: to what degree do potential entrants face high sunk costs? Now, I am using the particular term sunk costs here, and this is a very important distinction. One might be tempted to say there are high barriers to entry simply because it costs a lot of money to get into that industry. However, if this is truly an attractive investment, an attractive market to enter into, one would expect you to be able to raise funds, no matter how high the cost, to be able to enter into that market, if there is a positive return on your investment. What's important, actually, is the degree to which those investments are sunk. Now, sunk costs are investments that cannot be recovered. Classic examples would be things like research and development, the building of a factory that's very, very specialized for a particular technology or industry. So on one extreme, you could imagine the building of a big box store that if it doesn't work out for you, you could sell it to another tenant who could come in and retrofit it for perhaps another retail establishment or another industry. On the other extreme, there could be then those types of investments, factories and the like, that are incredibly specialized. You think of the semiconductor industry, where it requires a very specialized fabrication facility to be able to produce those microprocessors. This degree to which these investments are sunk creates a barrier to entry because they create a higher risk to those who enter that industry. This is not an industry with high sunk costs that you can easily enter and then exit and recover your costs, recoup your costs. So as a result, a high sunk cost creates greater risk for entering in the industry, and that greater risk raises the profitability assumptions that you need to enter, and as a result creates a potential barrier to entry here. So you might have heard in other classes and in other experiences that sunk costs should be ignored, and that's very true once you incur a sunk cost. However, before you incur a sunk cost, you want to think about how that affects your risk profile here. And once again, higher sunk costs raise your risk because it's harder to back out of those investments and can act as a potential barrier to entry. Second thing we want to think about: whether incumbent firms have a competitive advantage. Obviously, if incumbents have a competitive advantage, it's going to be very hard for entrants to compete and survive and be profitable in that industry. Now, these sources of a competitive advantage for incumbents can come from many different sources. It could be, once again, legal barriers such as patents and licenses. But in many cases, it might be other less restrictive types of competitive advantages. So, for example, pioneering brands. We can all think of firms whose names have become synonymous with the products that they sell. Google, you do a Google search. Make a Xerox, use a Kleenex. In any of these cases, it could be argued that the brands themselves have value that make it very hard for others to enter and compete in those markets. I always like to tell my students, though, to be cautious in how far you push brands as a logic for a barrier to entry, simply because the history is littered with many examples of successful brands that eventually find themselves outcompeted by rivals who come in with some new novel concept or innovative product offering. Third thing to think about in terms of competitive advantages as a barrier to entry are things called pre-commitment contracts. These are various ways in which the existing players within the industry lock out potential entrants from important complementary assets. A classic case of this would be distribution channels. So take the airline industry. In some airports, one airline might be able to lock up most of the gates, not allowing others then to enter and use that airport as a place to fly out of. They, in essence, lock up the distribution channel, preventing entry into that segment. A fourth thing to think about are economies of scale. The larger the economies of scale, the greater the barrier to entry within an industry. So let me talk about this one in a little more detail here. The idea of economies of scale is simply as output increases, the larger the output that you have, average costs go down. We talked a little bit about this in the last session. So what you see here is a little chart where you have AC stands for average cost. We have prices or costs on the y-axis and output on the x-axis, the horizontal axis. And as you see, as you increase the volume of your output, the per unit cost goes down. There's eventually a point that we refer to as the minimum efficient scale, the MES. The minimum efficient scale is, in essence, the amount of output necessary to be cost competitive within the industry. Now, it's interesting, a lot of this might be generated just simply by the technology inherent in the industry, and there's those who've done analyses to show what the minimum efficient scale is in various different industry segments. In the mass-produced beer segment, for example, the minimum efficient scale to be cost competitive in that segment is actually quite large, in the order of millions of barrels that need to be produced of beer to be cost competitive. In other industries, it might be very small, and you can just get a small chunk or percentage of the market share of an industry and have enough volume to be cost competitive. And you can actually find resources, indexes, that will tell you what the efficient scale is in various industries. Related to economies of scale is the notion of learning curves, or sometimes called experience curves. And the idea here is the steeper the learning curve, the greater the barrier to entry. Learning curves look a lot like economies of scale, but they have a slight and important difference. Learning curves are generated by the cumulative output over time, not just the volume of output in any given production cycle. The idea, very simply, is that over time, as you produce more and more, you learn. You learn how to do things more efficiently, you lower your costs, perhaps improve your quality. It's not hard for all of us to think of many examples, perhaps in our own lives, where the more you do something, you get more proficient and better at it. Lots of industries have learning curves at the heart of their dynamics. One in particular that's interesting is the semiconductor industry, which has found over time that there is a steep learning curve in which you move down that learning curve, lowering your cost structure. For later entrants into the industry, they have to move down that learning curve to catch up to existing competitors within the industry. And that time it takes you to catch up to those competitors serves as a barrier to entry. You realize perhaps as a potential entrant, you'll never be able to catch up with them, and as a result, you don't enter in the first place. Here we see some data from the semiconductor memory industry, an industry that has been characterized by what's called Moore's Law, the idea that there's a doubling of capacity roughly every 18 months. And this is a rule, if you will, a law that has been followed for going on 20, 30 years now. And what you see here is a representation of that in terms of cumulative output and the price per bit. This is on a log scale, so actually this is a much steeper dynamic than is even illustrated in this diagram here. And what you see is that over time, as output was accumulated, the price per bit has come down quite dramatically here over the years. This learning curve is in essence what has allowed Intel to be a very successful player in the microcomputer industry. As they've gotten ahead and competed and learned, they've lowered their costs and have been able to prevent many entrants from coming into the industry and competing with them, because it would be just cost prohibitive for someone to try to catch up with them at this point. Third thing to think about in terms of entry is the degree to which a potential entrant actually faces retaliation. Now, what do we mean by retaliation? We mean that the strategic behavior of the incumbent firms in the industry will try to basically force those entrants out of the market. The easiest thing to think about is in terms of pricing. Will they engage in a price war that will force down profits and hopefully then drive out the entrant from the industry? Now, not all firms are able to do this. There's a number of things we need to think about to the degree to which a firm can use retaliation, an incumbent firm, to stop entrants from entering. One thing to think about is the excess capacity of the existing players within the industry. Consider the following. Consider I'm a highly successful business and I have a plant and it's running at 100% capacity. There's a potential entrant that's going to come in and I decide I'm going to try to cut my prices to raise my demand. Well, if it's going to take me time to build up additional capacity, maybe I have to build a new plant and the like, In the short run, all a price cut will do is basically lower my profits. The new potential entrants can still come in and try to grab demand, maybe even at a higher price, because I am unable to meet the additional demand that's created from the lower prices that I'm now charging. On the flip side, if I have excess capacity, perhaps I'm running a manufacturing plant at only 60% capacity, and I have room to increase my output, then a price cut will then increase my demand. I can meet that demand because I have this excess capacity, and it allows me then to fight off these rivals who might be potentially trying to enter the industry. The airline industry suffers from this, especially during economic downturns, where there is often more capacity for airlines than there is demand for those airlines, especially seats on individual flights. And so there's incentives then to cut your prices to try to get more passengers in any given flight on any given plane. And that, as a result, lowers the prices and makes it more competitive. Second thing to think about are these economies of scale and other cost advantages I talked about previously. Not only do they just give you an absolute cost advantage, they also might allow you to engage in this type of pricing behavior and sustain the type of pricing behavior longer than potential entrants who might not enjoy those cost advantages. Third thing to think about are exit costs. Now, what are exit costs? Exit costs are payments that must be made upon the exit from an industry. Often, when you want to shut down a business, there are still costs that are incurred. Perhaps obligations that you've made in the past to pension funds and the like that must be met. Perhaps there is an environmental liability associated with a manufacturing plant that you have that you'll need to meet if you shut down that plant. Those exit costs actually provide an incentive to fight, because it might actually be in the decision calculus of the existing incumbents that while they might not be profitable, that exit is still more expensive than cutting their prices and fighting those potential entrants in the short run. So substantial exit cost increases the likelihood that a firm will want to fight potential entrants. Fourth thing to think about is simply, do some firms have an aggressive reputation? Do they have a reputation that they are going to respond to any potential entrant into their industry? Now, a famous example maybe in the software industry is Microsoft, who is well known for having a strong reputation for retaliation when firms try to potentially enter their industry segment. The key is it must be credible at some level. Just saying that, hey, we're going to be aggressive against potential entrants into our segment is insufficient. You must actually be able to back that up. And that actually goes back to some of the things we've already talked about. Do you have a cost advantage here? Do you have excess capacity? They all feed into whether you have an aggressive reputation. The challenge here is that unless you have a large position with the industry, a large percentage of the market share per se, you have what we call a free rider problem. One firm being aggressive to potential entrants in the industry is insufficient if others who are already in the industry don't respond in kind as well. So one could imagine if I try to engage in a price war, if no one else joins me in that, all I'm doing is hurting my own profitability potentially, especially if I don't have that excess capacity once again. So once again, likelihood of retaliation is something else we want to think about in terms of threats to entry.